Let's talk foreign exchange. We've talked really everything we've done so far has been domestic in nature. Now let's connect this to the worldwide financial markets and let's think about foreign exchange. What you probably do know about foreign exchange that we don't really need to spend much time on is the nominal exchange rate. And the nominal exchange rate just thinks about trading currencies. And this can be relevant, this can be important, but it also can be used to calculate the real exchange rate, which is something we're going to be more interested in this class. So the nominal exchange rate is just the price that currencies have relative to another currency. So for example, right now, $1 is equal to about 20 Mexican pesos. That's the nominal exchange rate. And in any given moment, and this happens very quickly through time, these are very perfect markets, you know, lots of buyers and sellers exchanging these items. Obviously, they're homogeneous, so it fits the perfect competition market that you would expect to see. In this market, you're going to see prices change a lot. So the US dollar could appreciate, which means that it gains value. So that term appreciation means something very specific to us in economics. It means the value of a currency rising relative to other currencies. And of course, it could depreciate as well. So for example, if we look at the exchange rate next week and we see that $1 is equal to 19 pesos, that would mean the US dollar has depreciated and the Mexican peso has appreciated. Okay, so that's the nominal exchange rate, which is good, useful, you know, in many different circumstances, but it's really simple. To give us a little bit more power and a little bit more economic discovery, we can think now about the real exchange rate, which is going to allow us to do more. All right, the real exchange rate is the exchange rate of the buying power of two currencies relative to the prices of items in those countries. Maybe not the most descriptive definition ever, but basically the real exchange rate is thinking, rather than what could we exchange currencies for, what could we buy after we exchange those currencies, all right? So if you go to Mexico and you take $100 and you exchange it for pesos, you get 2,000 in return. That would be the nominal exchange rate. The real exchange rate would ask this. If I had $100 in US, there's things I could buy in the US. Now, what if I went to it in Mexico, exchanged the money, and then bought Mexican goods? Would I be able to buy more goods in Mexico in that circumstance or more goods in the US? That is what the real exchange rate is looking at. And I think this will, it will be more clear once you see some examples here. So let's jump right into some examples. What you're going to need to solve for the real exchange rate is you're going to need some data. There's really 3 data points that you always need, 3 variables that you need to solve for these. So I'm going to talk about the price of beer. When I went to Mexico, I bought a lot of beer, you know, as one does. And I spent a lot of time thinking about prices, you know, because it was interesting how prices would be so low in Mexico relative to the U.S. You might not feel that way if you're in Mexico. You might not feel that beer is cheap. And that's kind of what the real exchange rate is getting at. It's not necessarily telling you is something expensive or cheap in a country. It's saying relative to the currencies is something expensive or cheap in that country. All right. So in other words, if you're living in Mexico and you're getting paid pesos, maybe beer doesn't feel cheap. On the other hand, if you have American dollars and you know what those American dollars could buy in terms of beer in the United States, after you exchange it in Mexico and then buy beer, it then feels really cheap. Okay, and that's what the real exchange rate is getting at. So in the United States, you know, the price of a beer in the U.S. might be like $3 just for like a domestic draft. Whereas when I went to Mexico, the price of a beer there, a few years back, was like 23 pesos or so is like a typical price. And so we're trying to figure out whether it's cheaper or expensive in the United States, and we're going to get a specific answer for how much cheaper or how much more expensive it is. The other thing you need is the nominal exchange rate. The nominal exchange rate can be reported in a couple of different ways. So let's just go ahead and provide both of these. At the time I'm writing this, $1 is equal to about 20 pesos, as I mentioned before. Now, if I wanted to be real specific here, I would be careful with rounding, but in this case, I'm just trying to explain the example here. So $1 equals 20 pesos. 1 peso equals 1 divided by 20, so $0.05. And by framing it that way, it gives me the nominal exchange rate from either country's perspective, okay? So if you're thinking about going from the U.S. to Mexico, $1 gets you 20 pesos. If you're thinking about coming from Mexico to the U.S., 1 peso would give you 5 cents. So that's thinking about it from either country's perspective. And so the real exchange rate, effectively, is the dollar price of the domestic good divided by the dollar price of the foreign good. Okay? So it's thinking about the relative prices after you exchange the currency. So to write this out more formally, this is how you're going to use those specific variables up there. Okay? The numerator, we don't need to do much work for, so I'm just using some shorthand here, but the dollar price is known. All right, it's clearly given to us. It's $3. So if we're thinking about the real exchange rate from the United States perspective, the price domestically is just given to you in the data, right? On the denominator side, the dollar price of the foreign good, we need to think about both the price in the foreign country and also the nominal exchange rate, the currency exchange rate that we have there. So this will be the price for the foreign good multiplied by the dollars needed to get, which is a long expression here, but the dollars needed to get one foreign currency. Okay? So that's an ugly equation, but that's what we need. And again, we're just figuring out the dollar price of the foreign good, but we need to think about exchanging the currency first. Okay? So in this question here, if we're trying to solve for the real exchange rate, and we allow the U.S. to be the domestic country, all right, so the numerator here is always going to be the country you're solving for, the domestic country. So if we're solving for this for the United States, the real exchange rate in the U.S. would be the dollar price in the U.S., which is $3, divided by the foreign price, 23 pesos, and then multiply that times the dollars needed to get one foreign currency, okay? So in this case, the amount of dollars you need is 0.05, 1 over 20. 1 over $20 will get you 1 peso, okay? And so that's why we get this 0.05. And so solving for that, what you would get is 2.609, roughly. So there's your answer. And then we need to make sure that we understand what that answer means. And I'm kind of running out of space here, so I'm just going to explain it. But on the quiz, you need to be prepared to answer this type of question. So write this down in your notes. I don't have the space. You do, okay? That 2.609 tells us this. The dollars it takes to buy a beer in the U.S. could be exchanged to buy 2.6 beers in Mexico. All right, let me say that again. The dollars needed to buy a beer in the U.S. could be taken to Mexico, exchanged, and buy 2.6 beers there. So if you've got, in this case, if you've got $3 in the U.S., you have two choices. If you have $3 in the U.S., you could buy one beer in the U.S., Or if you took those $3 to Mexico, you could buy 2.6 beers. That's what that is telling you, okay? So anytime this is greater than 1, if this value right here, the real exchange rate, is greater than 1, what that tells you is it's cheaper in the foreign country. If the real exchange rate is less than 1 for the US, then it's cheaper domestically. And if it's exactly equal to 1, then that means the real exchange rate is the same. So the real exchange rate being the same would mean that if you had $3 in the US to buy a beer, you could take those $3 to Mexico, exchange it, and that peso you have then would be able to buy 1 beer there as well, okay? So that's the real exchange rate. In this case, we solved for it for the US just to make sure we understand the logic. We could also solve for this for Mexico. So now all we're doing now is just imagining that Mexico is the domestic country. So the price domestically here is 23 pesos. And then we're going to divide that by the dollar price of the foreign good. We take the price foreign, so the price in the United States being $3. And then we multiply it times the pesos needed to get $1. The pesos needed to get $1, 20. And then the answer that we would get there in this specific question is about 0.383. And so again, when you solve for these types of questions on the quiz, be totally prepared to explain this. The problem with the real exchange rate is, if you can solve for that, but you don't know what it means, that is a total waste of time, okay? If you can solve for this, but you get this number, but you don't know what that number means, you have not accomplished anything, okay? So when I ask these questions, I'm almost always going to ask you to explain it. So on the quiz, I'm going to say, solve for the real exchange rate from Mexico, and then explain your answer. And what I've seen in the past is a lot of students could solve, but they did not know how to interpret it, which means that they don't really get the lesson. They don't really get the value from the lesson, all right? So what this is telling you is the pesos needed to buy a beer in Mexico could be exchanged to buy 0.38 beers in the United States. So the pesos you need to buy a beer in Mexico could only buy you 0.38 beers in the US after you exchange those pesos for dollars. So in the United States, beers are a lot more expensive once you consider the relative exchange rates. Notice this answer is the reciprocal of the answer that we solved for when we thought about the United States perspective. So if you can do it correctly for one country, you can simply use the reciprocal to solve for the other. But I'm going to say it again, make sure you're very careful when you're solving for these. If this was a normal in-class, exercise we were doing here, I would probably do 2 or 3 more examples. I'm not going to do that now, though. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a bunch of practice problems in the worksheet. Make sure you work through those. I'm telling you, a lot of people are going to miss all of these the first time they see it on the quiz, and that means you're going to get a very low quiz score. So you got to practice these, okay? I'm moving on because it's the same lesson over and over again, but you have to practice. Now, as an application, let's think about real exchange rates and how we might expect real exchange rates to change over time. Let's look at our example up here for beer in the United States, beer in Mexico, and the nominal exchange rate. In general, where would you rather buy beer in this example? If you're right now in the United States and you've got $3,000 in your bank account, and let's assume you're a raging alcoholic and you want to buy some beer, where would you buy it? You'd prefer to buy it in Mexico. The only thing holding you back is the fact that it's really expensive to go to Mexico. You cannot just instantaneously go to Mexico and purchase beer and then come right back, right? So the problem here is transaction costs. Transaction costs are many different costs, in fact, but we might try to define this as the cost associated with the purchase or sale of good that aren't connected to production. this is kind of a tough one to define, and there's some things that it's kind of hard to decide if it's a transaction cost or not. Some are very easy, some are very straightforward. So for example, transportation. Transportation is definitely a transaction cost. And when I say transportation, this could mean the customer driving to the producer, or it could mean the producer delivering out to the customer. Either way, it costs money to transact, right? It costs either the customer, the producer, or in most cases, both, for an item to get sold. So if you go to Amici to buy a beer, the producer has to get the beer to Amici, but also the consumer has to spend time and use up gas to get to Amici to purchase the good. So there's a transaction cost there. Language barriers, a form of transaction cost. If you're trying to buy a good from somebody in another country, of course there's transportation costs, but also it might be hard to communicate with that person, so you might need to hire a translator. Those would be transaction costs. And so those are like very obvious transaction costs. There are other forms. So arguably something like marketing expenses could be a transaction cost. So for example, Amici might have a beer I really want to drink, but I need to know about that. So part of the transaction cost might be informing consumers of options that they have in terms of consumption. So that might be a transaction cost as well. So in other words, maybe I would go to Mexico and buy a beer if I knew what the prices were there, and I need someone to market to me for me to figure that out. So what we're going to think about is this impossible scenario, but it allows us to do some analysis. Let's imagine that there were no transaction costs. Let's think about what would happen. So all of these transaction costs, transportation, language barriers, marketing, and so forth, all of those transaction costs went away. Let's think about what would happen in this circumstance. And to do that, I'm going to draw the supply and demand for beer in both countries. We already know the prices in this example. So in the U.S., we know that the price of beer is $3. We don't know what the quantity is. That's okay. The quantity is going to be not relevant to us in this example. And in Mexico, of course, 20 pesos. So, let's think about the scenario here. Imagine this is what we have, which is literally, these are roughly the prices in these two countries for these items. Let's imagine if transaction costs literally are zero, okay? Now, when I say literally are zero, what that means is if I want a beer in Mexico, just boom, I could have one right now, right? That would be possible. So there's no transaction cost. If I want something, I can buy it. So what that means is I would always buy the cheapest good, controlling for quality, right? So if there are Coronas for sale in both of these countries, I'm always going to buy it in Mexico as long as the price is lower. So what that's going to do is it's going to increase the demand in Mexico and decrease the demand in the United States. But it's not just a demand effect. There's also a supply effect. If there are no transaction costs, that means you can buy whatever good you want, but it also means you can sell it wherever you want, okay? So on the supply side of the market, you're going to have more producers try to sell in the United States and fewer try to sell in Mexico. And if there were literally no transaction costs, you can imagine that this would all just be very simultaneous, right? If there could somehow be some sort of invention that would completely eliminate transaction costs, prices would immediately fix, and you would get movements in supply and demand that would drive those price changes. So the result is the price in the United States would go down, and the price in Mexico would go up. And if you think about it, if there's really no transaction costs, what would eventually happen is the real exchange rate would move to 1. That would be the eventual outcome if there are no transaction costs. So in other words, if you're in the United States right now and you have $2,000 in your bank account, that $2,000 could buy the same amount of beer in Mexico or any other country for that matter. So your dollar would have the same buying power everywhere. There's a name for this idea. It's called the law of one price. And it's not a law in terms of this is actually what occurs, but it's a law if the assumption holds, if there are no transaction costs. So if there are no transaction costs, the law of one price says that the real exchange rate equals 1 everywhere. Because if they did it, well, then it would be very easy to basically arbitrage and get profits, right? If there was no real exchange rate equaling 1, if there were no transaction costs in this example here, then all you had to do to make profits is just go to Mexico, buy the beer, go back to the U.S., sell the beer. That's called arbitraging. If you've ever heard that term before, arbitrage effectively just means that you're taking advantage of prices being unequal in two places. You buy in the cheap place, you sell in the expensive place, and you reap infinite profits if you can keep doing that, right? So as people do that, it's going to do exactly what we showed here on these graphs. It's going to fix those prices until the real exchange rate is 1 everywhere. That's the law of one price. Now we can relax those assumptions a little bit. That obviously is very unrealistic, but it does have some important implications, and it does allow us to learn a bit about how prices are formed. But if we wanted to lax those assumptions a bit, let's think about a second example. Rather than thinking about individual goods, let's think about the cost of living, okay? So if you've ever solved for CPI, you've probably heard of a basket. A basket price basically refers to just a collection of normally consumed goods and services. So imagine like a typical family of 4. Think about what they buy every single year. A basket would be an approximate value of those things they buy. So it would be very close to thinking about the cost of living, okay? So as we know, if I wanted to buy a basket of goods in New York City, it's going to cost way more than it does here in Milledgeville. And that has to do with the fact that there are high transaction costs between those two cities. So let's think about this a bit between two countries now. Let's say that a basket in the U.S. costs us $60,000 US. Whereas a basket in Canada costs $80,000. Keep in mind now, we're comparing dollars to dollars, but in this case for the U.S., this is U.S. dollars. In this case for Canada, this is Canadian dollars, all right? And then we also would need to know the nominal exchange rate, and let's just say the nominal exchange rate is $1 US equals $1.4 in Canada. So from that, we can solve for the real exchange rate, right? This is something we practiced before, so we're going to see it one more time here really quickly. The real exchange rate in this case from the U.S. perspective. So let's do this from the U.S. That means we're going to put the price of the item, or in this case, all items, the basket. We're going to put the price in the numerator here. So 60,000. Divide that by the price in the foreign country, which is 80,000. And then we're going to multiply that times the number of dollars you need to buy a Canadian dollar. All right. So actually, I've kind of done this intentionally just so you would see an example like this. In this case, we don't actually have the information we need. All right. So if $1 US buys 1.4 Canadian, we need to figure out what 1 Canadian dollar would buy. Okay. And so what you would actually have here is 1 divided by 1.4. So that amount right there, whatever that comes out to, that's how many dollars you need to get a Canadian dollar. That's the interpretation there. So if we solve for that, what we would get is the real exchange rate in the U.S. is 1.05. If we wanted to solve for Canada, you can do this on your own. You would find that this comes out to about 0.95. So what this tells you here is, by the real exchange rate in the U.S., pause the video because I want to make sure I explain what this value means. What this means is, first of all, anytime you see a value greater than 1, That means it's cheaper in the foreign country, okay? So what this specifically tells us is the amount of money you have in the U.S. could be exchanged for Canadian dollars and then buy 5% more in that foreign country. In this case, we're talking a basket, all right? So to think about literally what this means in this specific example, if you have $60,000 in the U.S., you could exchange that for Canadian currency, and then you'd be able to buy 1.05 baskets in Canada. So you would immediately have more buying power in Canada. And the opposite is true here, all right? If you're in Canada and you have 80,000 Canadian dollars, if you move to the U.S., exchange your currency for U.S. dollars, you'd be able to buy less, okay, in the United States. So we don't know anything about specific goods. We don't know what prices are individually occurring. This is more like a real-world example, right? Some things are going to be cheaper in Canada. Some things are going to be cheaper in the U.S. But what it's telling you here is the cost of living is higher in the U.S. In the long run, what might you expect to happen? Okay? In the long run, what you would probably expect to happen is people would move from the U.S. to Canada. Now, this is not going to happen quickly, and it may not literally happen either. But if you're thinking about people moving, this is a driving force. Rational people think at the margins. This is changing the incentives. So maybe you wouldn't literally pack up your bags and move to Canada as a result of this if you're here right now in Milledgeville. But you can imagine some examples of people moving. Let's say right now that you live in Seattle. Maybe you really would move over the border and live in Vancouver instead. Or maybe you get offered a job in the United States and you're really having a tough decision deciding of whether you're going to work in Canada or the United States. You can't make up your mind. They seem like very similar jobs. But you learn about these differences, well, maybe you decide to take the job in Canada. In the long run, you would expect this to sort itself out, all right? And that would be particularly true if the answers were much different from this. You know, imagine if this was 4 and 0.25 for these real exchange rates. Well, then absolutely you can imagine people moving to Canada, right? That's what you would expect to see here. So what that tells you is you would expect to see the real exchange rate be close to 1 between two countries, especially countries that are nearby, okay? So this is similar to the law of one price, but it's not thinking about individual prices, all right? What we're talking about here is not that beer is always going to be the same price everywhere when you control for exchange rates. Instead, what it's saying is that if you had a certain amount of money, you can move wherever you want with that money and have a certain amount of buying power, okay? We call this purchasing power parity. You've probably heard this term before in relation to thinking about buying power. Purchasing power parity. PPP. And this is the idea that when people are mobile, freely able to move, okay? So there still could be transaction costs, all right? In other words, it's still possible that beer is way cheaper in Mexico, okay? And people aren't really moving because of beer. But if everything is way cheaper in Mexico, over time, you would expect people to move there. So purchasing power parity is the idea that when people are mobile, a given unit of currency, such as the dollar, will have roughly the same buying power everywhere. And I want to make sure I'm very clear here because this sounds so similar to the law of one price. But again, the difference here is the law of one price says the price of any individual good or service will be the same everywhere. Whereas this is saying $1 has the same buying power everywhere. It doesn't mean $1 buys the same amount of beer everywhere. It just means that in general, $1 has the same power. Okay? So if we think about the cost of living, having $100,000 in the U.S. would mean you have the same ability to live as you would in any other country starting with $100,000 in U.S. money. Okay? That's the concept of purchasing power parity. And the logic here is the fact that people are mobile will change prices. Very similar to the law of one price, with just the difference thinking about the fact that we're talking about buying power of currency, not the price of everything. So what we would expect to see in this example, and I could draw supply and demand to show this yet again, but what you would expect to see is consumers would move to Canada. And when those consumers move to Canada, their prices would go up a little bit. When people move out of the U.S., there's less demand in the U.S., so our prices would go down a bit. So this is basically showing that the mobility of people will cause prices to roughly calibrate. And if that seems impossible, you could take it a little bit less extreme of an example and think about businesses. All right, maybe it's hard for people to move, but it's absolutely feasible that businesses would move, okay? So businesses that need to consume a lot of goods or produce a lot of goods are also going to move relative to thinking about where the prices are higher or lower. And so this general mobility of people will find deals, people will find values. And purchasing power parity is basically just pointing out that as people move around to exploit the system, the cost of living is going to calibrate and become closer to equal over time. All right? Now, they're not literally going to have, you're not going to have full parity, right? Full parity would mean the literal answer of $1 having the same buying power everywhere. That won't happen because people are not perfectly mobile, because transaction costs do exist. However, what we do know, thinking about some takeaways here, what we do know is that in the long run, real exchange rates, whether we're talking about individual goods and the law of one price, or whether we're thinking about the cost of living, basket prices, and purchasing power parity. Regardless, in the long run, what we actually do see is that the real exchange rate tends to move towards 1. So if you see a real exchange rate that is really out of whack, it's not going to go to 1 literally, but it will move in that direction. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say that the real exchange rate for some item is 5. Okay, right now I'm looking at the real exchange rate for some item and it's 5. Let's say it's lumber. Okay, now it's not going to go to 1. It's not literally going to go to 1, but it will likely move towards 1. Okay, and that's what the research shows. So if the real exchange rate is 5, over time, it's going to tend to move towards 1 very slowly, very gradually. Okay, part of the reason for that is that transaction costs are dropping in the world. We're getting better at dealing with transaction costs. We can think about this on multiple fronts. The internet made it way easier to communicate with people, and we're still benefiting from that. We're still not at a point where we fully realize the internet's potential. So if you think about it, if you need to buy something from another person in Japan, 30 years ago, that would have been impossible, okay? If you want to buy something like, let's say it's just like some very specific item, like an antique. Very hard for you to buy an item from Japan 30 years ago. What are you going to do, call them on the phone, right? You don't speak the same language. There's really no way for you to communicate. But when you have things like eBay and Amazon, it makes it way easier for these transactions to take place. We don't really need to speak the same language anymore. We can figure out a way to make these transactions occur. So we've reduced transaction costs. We've gotten better at moving things across the ocean. The cost of moving something across the ocean is incredibly cheap now. We've gotten more efficient with our vehicles. So if we're moving something within the United States, for example, it's cheaper. So transaction costs in general are going down. So what that means is when real exchange rates are far away from 1, right, either really high or really low, you can expect it to move towards 1 because transaction costs are dropping through time. All right, so although the law of one price is not literally true, it does bear some guidance in thinking about how prices will change over time. Also, what we can learn is when real exchange rates are very high or very low, often it's a result of particularly high transaction costs. So if we think about two areas that have very different prices, a lot of times transaction costs are what's driving that. So those transaction costs could be things like tariffs, right? Taxes on imported goods could be an example of why this would happen. Immigration laws. Great distance barriers or language barriers. And we could continue going down this list. Even things like cultural differences tend to play a role here. And so basically what you can realize is that if you see real exchange rates of 5 for an item, there's usually a reason for that. Okay, and those reasons could be something like tariffs. So what that means is if a tariff gets repealed, you can expect the real exchange rate to move towards 1. Same deal with immigration laws. Right now in the United States, it's 2021, right? It's gotten harder to move around because of COVID. I bet that's made the real exchange rates go further away from 1. I'd be certain that that's what I would see from the data, okay? And that's the kind of takeaway you can get from this, right? The law of one price is not literally true, but if you understand the implications, you can think of something like COVID and recognize that that's going to push prices very far away. Conversely, if you find that the real exchange rate is 1, then there's probably very low transaction costs. And if you think about things that have low transaction costs, this is indeed going to be the case. So for example, something like buying stocks, right? If you want to buy Netflix stock right now, everybody faces the same price in the United States. Everybody faces the same price everywhere on Earth. Now, that doesn't mean the real exchange rate is 1 for everyone because there's also nominal exchange rates. But it goes to show when there are very low transaction costs. When it comes to buying something like stock, you're going to expect to see the real exchange rate very close to 1. And again, if you see this, you can expect low transaction costs. If you see the real exchange rate close to 1, that tells you something about this good. It tells you that good does not have high transaction costs. So there's a lot of usable information here. And it goes to show that you can expect things like Mexico and Canada to have prices relatively close to the United States, whereas if you go really far away from the U.S., if you go to like Australia, even though U.S. and Australia are culturally similar, I bet the prices there are much different than here because of higher transaction costs. So we start with a really simple idea, thinking about prices, and it allows us to understand more about how international trade and the world in general works. Remember, we're talking about exchange rates in the long run here, so these are very gradual changes. What we're going to do next is think about why we have these disparities in the short run. Why can prices go really out of whack in the short run?